how can linguistics researchers inform researchers on how their child thinks? Like, are the linguistic categories that they, like, I guess, like verbalize out the same as like what goes on into their head?
Who knows? Is that true for us? I don't know. I mean, I mean, we don't really know for sure what goes on in anybody's head, right? That's a whole philosophical conundrum about,
Mm-hmm.
how do we know? I mean, generally speaking, if someone is communicating with you effectively, they'll be happier, right? If they're asking for the things that they want and you're giving them the things they're expressing, and that does in fact make them happy, that suggests that you have actually had a successful communicative interaction. That's a good indicator that actually what they intended to convey is in fact what they did convey. Um, but I mean, deeply, are they working, and, there's theories out there like Susan Carey's got a theory that there are some words that they mean really different things by than we do. And that's something you have to learn. Alive is one that she studied a lot, right? Do kids know what it means to be alive? Do they think it means the same thing that we think it means to be alive? And so she's actually argued that, yeah, maybe they don't. Like maybe their theory about what, like, to be alive is, it doesn't have to be the same one as ours. That's true. It can be true for anything when you get to really abstract stuff. But that's also a scientific question, right? So if you ask a physicist, what does velocity mean? They actually think it means something different than I think it means, because they
Mm.
have a technical definition for it, and I don't think I know what that is, right? But even for a word like alive, that may be well true for kids as well, but probably doesn't interact with most of your everyday life.
Okay, okay. So then, um, is there any way that we could actually fully, like, I guess, like, penetrate that like black box of their mind in terms
I
of
mean,
like what mental
fully
representations they have?
that's what developmental psychologists do all the time. I mean, so like Susan Carey has like this wonderful research program where, I mean, first you have to have the hypothesis about what they have in their head, and then you can test that hypothesis, right? So if you have a hypothesis that, you know, that they mean, so for instance, one of the things people think that kids might mean by alive is like has motion, is self-propelled motion, right? That's what it really, that's the key to being alive, is that you have self-propelled motion, which means that like cars would be alive, and it would mean like sunflowers would not be, right? Because like cars have, if you just look at a car, it looks like it has self-propelled motion, right? I mean, when you see it on the street, there it goes. But you look at your average plant and it doesn't move. And there is some evidence that, so if that's your hypothesis about what kids might mean by alive, you can test it, find out if that's true. And it does actually look like you can confuse kids with some stuff like this. Like they're not completely sure. Really, cactus, is it? Right? That's rough. Um, so you have to have a hypothesis. So what you do if you're a developmental psychologist in this sense is you listen very carefully to kids and you watch them very carefully and you see if you can guess what's going on in their head. And then once you have a guess, you can test it. But the thing is, I mean, it's true of all experiments. You can only test something if you have a hypothesis. So if we're, and we're adults and maybe we're just crazy wrong about what's going on, and our hypotheses are all just like wildly off base, and we keep putting these crazy questions to kids and they keep answering them and we think we know what it means and maybe we don't. But that's true of all science, right? Your answers are only going to be as good as the questions that you ask. So we think we're asking reasonably good questions, and we actually, I mean, part of the proof in the pudding for a lot of the things that we're doing is that we actually can like fix things that are problems, and we can help things happen and things like that, right? So, for instance, when it comes to something like reading, um, linguists actually are pretty sure they know what's involved with reading. Like we have a good analysis of what it means to read. And one of the pieces of proof that maybe we're right would be, well, if we're right, like the following three things would help a child read. And lo, when you do those things, actually they read more quickly and they are better at it and all that kind of stuff. And that's like that's one of the ways you measure the effectiveness of your theory, right? I have a prediction. Does it pan out? A lot of like, so there's lots of predictions that have panned out reasonably well. That doesn't mean there isn't some alternative theory that isn't like lurking in the background somewhere that we haven't thought of, but it does mean that our theory actually is accounting for some interesting data.
Okay. And what's like the most convincing hypothesis slash theory for you?
In what context?
in the context of like theory testing and how they and their mental representations and what concepts might be reflective of like their linguistic capacities and categories.
I mean, personally, I mean, I come from the nativist tradition, and I mean, you are, you get raised in a tradition. So I mean, I find it fairly compelling that there's things that humans can do that no other animals can do, for instance. I find it compelling, so I'm a nativist. Um, that there's something that you are born with that guides the language acquisition process. I think that I'm a semantics person, so I actually think there's a lot of concepts that are there that you have that sort of organize your mental representations and organize your linguistic acquisition. There's plenty of people who disagree with me.
Mm-hmm.
You've been to Ohio State, there's people who have offices down the hall from me who disagree with me violently. But that's sort of like where that's where the fun is, right? I'm a nativist. I think it's going to work like this. I can make a set of predictions. They make different predictions. We see who gets better data out of it. Like I say, I actually think that when it comes to like big theories, almost certainly what's true is something that's more or less in the middle. Like very few extreme theories are ever like perfectly right. But part of what gets you is you sort of what's the theory that you resonate to, like what's the one that makes sense to you, what's the one that like drives the kinds of predictions that you want to make. My feeling is that the more linguistically oriented you get, more linguists tend to gravitate towards the nativist position, partly for historical reasons because Chomsky is such an important figure in our field, but also partly because the more you play with it, the more you're like, oh yeah, what would be the evidence that would get you to this? Like, it is weird that this is cross-linguist, this happens in all the world's languages, right? If this was really some kind of contingent arbitrary thing that came from your environment, it's a little shocking how common it is, and it's a little shocking how fast it happens and how regularly it happens and how consistently it happens, and all of that kind of stuff. So I mean, I think that from my point of view, the deeper you get into like the linguistics details, the more the native position starts to make sense. But like I say, there are linguists who disagree with me on this one too. I mean, there's plenty of people on the other side.